Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Danielle Smaha, and I am Manomet's Director of Marketing and Communications. Thank you so much for joining us today for an exciting opportunity to ask Trevor Lloyd-Evans, Manomet's Director of Landbird Conservation, all of your questions about the landbirds he has worked with over his long career with Manomet. If you're new to Manomet, Manomet empowers stakeholders through science. Manomet was founded as the Manomet Bird Observatory to provide a site for long-term studies of birds and other aspects of southeastern Massachusetts' natural history and ecology. Our banding lab was the first of its kind on the east coast of North America and continues its research on migratory birds through today. Over the years, our science and research have expanded to focus on ecosystem management and resilience, shorebird conservation, and educating tomorrow's leaders about the importance of the natural world. Diversity, science, and climate change are the fundamental principles driving Manomet's work today. I have just a couple of quick things to share before turning things over to Trevor. We're going to start off with a few of the questions that we are most frequently asked about our banding lab and the birds that migrate through our Plymouth headquarters. But we really want to hear from you and have the opportunity to answer all of your questions. So please look down at the bottom of your Zoom screen where you should see a box marked Q&A. If you don't see it, use your mouse pointer to hover over the bottom and it should appear. If at any point during today's conversation you have a question, feel free to click on that Q&A box to enter it. We are monitoring the Q&A and we will answer as many questions as we possibly can today. If you're unable to stay for the entirety of today's presentation, it is being recorded. We will send you a follow-up email with a link to the recording in the next day or so. Now let's get started. I am sure that for some of you, Trevor Lloyd-Evans needs no introduction. Trevor has been a part of Manomet since 1972. For hundreds of interns and volunteers who have come through our banding lab, Trevor has served as a hands-on teacher about bird biology and conservation. He has also shared the wonders of birds with the thousands of school children and other visitors. His research has taken him from the Arctic to Belize to Israel, as well as throughout the US, Europe, and Africa, and he has been published in a wide range of scientific journals. Now, I'd like to turn it over to Trevor.
Danielle, thank you so much. This is exciting. I like talking about birds. This is also informal. But I would like to just say a couple of things when we start. How did we really start in all of this? And we do, of course, have to mention our founder, who was Kathleen Anderson, who started off this whole organization that was in those days Manomet Bird Observatory back in 1966, some of the banding, and then officially from 1969 onwards. Also, there have been hundreds of trained volunteers, dozens and dozens and dozens of banding staff, and hundreds of interns over the years who have spent whole seasons at Manomet, working on our 50 nets scattered around the property, bringing the birds back to the lab, safely learning how to handle birds, take the data, and send them on their way as quickly as we can. And particularly, even though this has been going on for more than 50 years, this last year has been a challenge to all of us. We had to reduce our spring banding to just some sampling, but I'm really glad to say that in the fall, we had 4 wonderful people, 4 banders, 2 experienced banders from the past, Megan Gray and Sarah Duff, and 2 post-undergraduate biology interns, Cynthia Ramirez and Jeremiah Sullivan, and they agreed to shelter in place at Manomet, even though the observatory was officially closed, and they did by far the bulk of the fall banding. We had a good season. We had more birds than last year, and that was because there are more birds, so life is good. We also had one experienced volunteer, Pat Randall, who turned up and helped on several occasions, and then Alan Nidal and Evan Dalton and myself from the banding staff. But Danielle, why don't we jump to the summary questions just so that we can give everyone the basics, and we'll take it from there.
Excellent. So the first question today, Trevor, is Manomet's location in Plymouth, Massachusetts an especially good place to see songbird migration?
All right, let's jump to the next slide. And yes, it is. And this is the bird that you will see when you come to Manomet. We have banded new bandings just at the Manomet location in spring and fall from 1966 through 2020. We've now finished our season on the 15th of November. which, as you can all estimate, was just 2 days ago. And over that period, we have newly banded over 250,000 birds. So that's our basic sample of migrants. We band in the spring during the migration period from about the 15th of April through till the 15th of June. Then we close down the 50 nets that we have scattered around the property. The nets stay in the same locations, and ever since 1970, they have been in exactly the same locations. Sort of give or take 1 or 2 movements due to bluffs collapsing or expansions of the house at one point. But basically with the same system of mist nets, each of which is 12 meters, that's about 39 feet long, and 2.6 meters high. So that would be about 7 feet high. On set locations, we have a standardized manner of catching the birds. And of course, during the spring and fall migrations, 5 days a week, we go around from dawn to dusk with our extensive staff, going out about every 45 minutes or so, and meeting up and bringing the birds back, banding them, letting them go again. We also do recapture some of the same birds. If you can imagine you're a white-throated sparrow and you've come here for the winter, then you probably would get caught a couple of times during the fall when you arrive, and probably you'll get caught again in the spring. Also the breeding birds, and so the breeding birds will probably get caught a couple of times when they arrive, and then we close down the netting, don't forget, on the 15th of June to let everyone breed in peace and have their families and get the young off and get the young independent. And then we start our fall migration on about the 15th of August and continue on through the 15th of November. So that's a longer season, reflecting the fact that fall migration is longer. There are more birds coming by. So all in all, with the new birds that we have banded, the 250,000 plus, and all of the recaptures of banded individuals, and we'll come to why that's important later, then we've this fall handled our 400,000th bird, and that's a lot of birds. Next slide, please. Let's look at the habitat. This is the view that these poor banders who were sequestered and had to shelter in place got to see every morning. But I do emphasize morning. It's a dawn to dusk job. You're on the bluff at Manomet, and you're looking out southeast. We can see a little bit of Manomet Point. The sun's just rising in the east where it should be. This is good. Looks like a good morning. And there's a blur on the horizon, which is Cape Cod. So many of the land birds, nearly all of the land birds, but not all, but nearly all of them actually do their migrations at night. They are nocturnal migrants. So after a night's flight in the fall from somewhere north or northwest of Manomet, the bird comes along and the sun starts to rise, and they're looking down from their night flight and looking down for somewhere nice and green to put down. They find themselves out over the ocean, which could happen if there had been strong northwest winds last night, perhaps. Then they will reorient and they'll come back to the land and again land on a green spot on the coast. So our question really is Manomet a good place for migrants? Anywhere on the coast is a good place for migrants. And Manomet is a particularly good place. Can we look at the next slide? And that's the bird's eye view as they come in and the dawn comes up. And as opposed to, some people would say, too many houses on the South Shore, here's a green spot. And so this is Manomet's acreage here. All of the wooded area and the buildings you can see in the middle of the picture there are Manomet headquarters. Thank you, wonderful. And then the shoreline on the south runs all the way along. And our property contains all of the wooded area, a section of the pond, which is in the upper middle of our picture there. Thank you. And also going over to the left, we've added in the Holmes Farm. And so those were former cranberry bogs, and we're doing wetland restorations there. So we have, that's our 40 acres total. As you're dropping in from your night flight then, why did you migrate at night? Good question. You migrated at night because it's a little bit cooler. And so you would avoid the heat of the day during the hotter parts. You avoid migration, predation. because I don't think a peregrine falcon or a merlin is going to be flying around and snatching you out of the air. You're up at the range for most songbirds of probably 1,000 or 2,000 up to 5,000 maximum feet, and you're moving along in steady air, and there are none of the heating and the heat rising and the perturbations of the natural wind currents. You're more likely to be in the fall having a tailwind on a nice clear night with the prevailing northwesterlies. In the spring, the prevailing winds around here are southwest. And so in both of those spring and fall migrations, that westerly component will push the birds to the east, and they will move up the coast. And so again, the coast is a good place to accumulate birds. Offshore islands and distant places like that are also wonderful places to accumulate birds, but hard to get to for people and hard to do all of the visiting and education work that we love to do at the headquarters. I think that covers pretty much why it's a good place. Danielle, what's our next question?
So here's a question that we frequently get on social media as well. Why do we ban birds?
I love it. It's a nice, simple question. Let's pull up the next slide. So the original reason for banding birds, when it was mainly a fish and wildlife, let's ban the ducks and find out where they all go, back at the turn of the last century. Banding's been going on for well over 100 years now. The idea was that if you put a light aluminum band on a bird's leg, very light, usually 1% of body weight, and absolute maximum, actually less than that, but absolute maximum one ever encumbers a bird with would be 2% perhaps. So here's a very light band made of aluminum. It's the federal program, so this is run by the US Fish and Wildlife Service, jointly with the Canadian Wildlife Service. And our joint international banding lab is on the edge of Washington, DC at Patuxent. And so we are licensed by the feds. We are also licensed by the states, state of Massachusetts, and any other states in which we ban birds. And that pretty much covers the, where do we get the bans from? The bans all have an address which says something like 1-800-327-BAND, which is a sort of a way that you can get there with a telephone. Or it says Inform Fish and Wildlife Service, Washington, DC, USA. And essentially each of those bands has a number that is not used on any other bird in the North American scheme. Incidentally, we do hope that at some point in the near future, we'll be able to pull Mexico in and make it really North American. But those talks are going on at the moment. And so if anyone finds a bird, even if they don't know what it is, and they do this 1-800-327-BAND, or they send the band into Fish and Wildlife Service, or they look online, they will find that the information gets back to the Fish and Wildlife Service and then comes back to us. So what do we end up with? We end up with a lot of dots. Over the time that Manomet has been banding, these are by no means all of our recoveries, but each of those red dots represents a bird that was banded at the Manomet Bird Observatory and went to the red dot place. It might have been moving from breeding at Manomet down south, generally speaking, in migration. Or it might have been moving northwards through Manomet north on spring migration. And of course, there are many other banders. In fact, quite a number of our banding recoveries come from another bander at another location finding a bird. For example, down on the southern tip of Florida, there is a red dot and a green dot, and a little tiny promontory down at the southern tip of Florida, and that is the town of Homestead. Thank you, right there. And that's one individual who was a Manomet friend called Johnny Fisk. And Johnny Fisk lived in Orleans, but had a little winter home down in Homestead. And she was a bird bander. She helped Kathleen Anderson and me and others band at Manomet in the early days. And she was banding a yellow-rumped warbler, a myrtle warbler, at her winter quarters down there in Homestead, Florida. And the bird turned around in the spring and came up to Manomet, and we caught it. and vice versa. So one of the longest distance migrants for yellow-rumped warblers was actually banded at Manomet, and Johnny Fisk, sure enough, caught that bird and read that band number. We have 400 odd recoveries in there, and they do represent quite a diversity of birds. We actually have included a few shorebirds in here, but not very many. So let's look at British Columbia, way off in the left and up on the top there. What's happening there? A friend of ours called Gwyn Loud, who is banding on a sub-permit from Manomet, was banding siskins, pine siskins, which are finches that erupt in some years out of the boreal forests and come on down. And this bird was banded in the Manomet area, actually just in one of the suburbs of Boston, in one winter and let go, disappeared. We would think never to be seen again. And lo and behold, the following winter, the bird went to probably home, or at least close to home, which was British Columbia. So here was a pine siskin, a small bird about the size of a house finch or a goldfinch, flying all the way from the western part of the United States, and in fact, just over the Canadian border, coming east because of the interruptive movement, and spending the winter on our east coast and going back. So this is sort of the prime or original reason for banding birds. Where do they go? When do they get there? We know who's there in the winter, we know who's there in the summer. If we look down into Mexico, we'll see 2 recoveries down there. These were a couple of what we call neotropical migrants, birds that bred at Manomet or north of Manomet and were heading south in the fall migration. One of those is a trails flycatcher, either willow or alder flycatcher. This was an early recovery, and back in those days, the 2 species, which are really difficult to tell apart, even in the hand, were not actually separated, and they were known as trails flycatchers in those days. But there it was, probably going down to its wintering area and maybe even continuing on down from Mexico, possibly as far as Colombia. The other bird was a Baltimore oriole. And so the Baltimore oriole from somewhere around us went on down and ended up in that part of Mexico, which would be a very sensible sort of wintering area. Looking down into Colombia, we would have black-billed cuckoos that we have banded that have spent the time down there. I think there's a dot on the very southern part, which is an osprey that was banded with our bands by Dr. Alan Poole down in the Westport River area. And that went down to the Rio Negro and Amazon Junction in Amazonia and spent the winter there. So that's one reason for banding birds. But there are other reasons. Once we've got a band on a bird, that tells us where they go in migration. It tells us where they breed. It tells us when they get there and how long they stay there. And another aspect would be with those recoveries of banded birds that I referred to earlier. If we have birds breeding near Manomet, then it's very likely that those individuals will come back to exactly where they were hatched in the first place. Birds are very good at coming back to their territory. Their navigational skills are amazing. And so as we catch a previously banded bird, it might happen in the second year or the third year after we catch it, if it's breeding around us. This fall, we caught, I think, our oldest northern cardinal. And this northern cardinal, which really doesn't migrate much at all, but just wanders around on a very local basis, pretty much a permanent resident. But this bird has been at Manomet for 11 years at this point. So we were able to recapture it over a number of those years. And the last one was this fall, and that bird is now 11 years old. Our oldest land bird, I think, was a hairy woodpecker. And Mrs. Hairy Woodpecker was hanging around Manomet for 14 years and would turn up on our nets. So probably about once or twice in a year, she would make a mistake and fly into one of our 50 nets and be taken back and have her brand number read and patted on the head and weighed and measured and let go again. And the oldest band that we have actually recorded was down on Plymouth Beach. I was going down Plymouth Beach as the Boston Globe reporter who wanted to see birds in the middle of summer, not in the spring or fall migration. So we went down the beach and we went down to the Arctic tern and common tern colony, which was down at the end of the beach in those days. and there was a dead tern lying on the ground. So I picked it up, always pick it up and check it for bands. There was a band, and that band had been put on the Arctic tern in that very same colony 26 years previously by a bird bander named Oliver Austin Sr. And so here was a bird that had bred for 26 years, come back after its first year or second year, maybe after that, and then bred consistently onto the age of 26. And apart from breeding on Plymouth Beach, it would migrate down the east coast of America, the east coast of South America, and probably end up wintering somewhere down in Argentina, possibly even around the Horn in Chile, and some of them going as far as the Antarctic Peninsula down below. So another reason for banding birds, getting an idea of how old they can be. We can look at the timing of migration. If we recapture the bird a number of times, we can find how long it stops over at Manomet. And that has led to studies of what you eat when you're stopping over, what sort of berries are good, are native berries good, are non-native berries good, how much weight you put on and how quickly, because we weigh each of those individuals. And I think the last thing we can do is we can look at population trends, because we do have this unique resource of 50 years of data. There are 4 organizations, 4 bird banding observatory type organizations in North America that have been banding very large numbers of songbirds over these 50 years. One is in Lake Ontario, it is the, I'm sorry, let's go to California first. We had Point Reyes Bird Observatory, which is in the Point Reyes Peninsula, just north of San Francisco. Over in Lake Ontario, north of us, is Long Point Bird Observatory, a Canadian bird observatory. And the other really long-term banding station has been in Western Pennsylvania. And this is part of the Carnegie Museum at the Powder Mill Nature Reserve in Western Pennsylvania. So given that length of time, that enables us to count the number of birds going by very accurately, because each one is banded, we know who they are. It's not like censusing birds and wondering if you're seeing the same red start the second day that you saw the day before, or is it a different one moving through? Each of these is individually banded. It's very precise from that point of view. And so it does give us the opportunity to look at some population changes. And lastly, birds are just wonderful indicators of all sorts of changes. It may be changes in landscape, it may be increasing urbanization, it may be climate change. And so birds, when they don't like a habitat, vote with their wings and move rapidly on. And so that ability has been really wonderful for us and enables us to look at a whole series of long-term studies with a variety of students from universities and colleagues, and really taking advantage of the 50 years of data. Any more questions, Danielle?
We do. So can you touch on again how many birds that you have banded at the banding lab and what kind of trends you see from the data that you're collecting?
Yeah, let's go on to the next slide. And the next slide will talk about, and this is, I think, the only boring graph. Well, no, there might be another boring graph later on, but this is the mostly the data graph. So we've handled, we said, about 400,000 birds as of this fall, and that's the initial bandings and the recaptures. Here, we're just looking at the numbers of initial captures. So we're looking at the number of new birds coming through Manomet in the spring on the left in blue, and in green on the right in fall. And the x-axis, the bottom axis on these graphs starts at 1970, where we had the standardized nets open through that standardized period of spring migration from mid-April through mid-June. And we have also kept track very carefully of each of our 50 nets, how many of them were open and for how many hours each day. So that if one were to open 10 of the nets, but the rest were too hot or too blowy and we close them down, or rain started to come in, we'll close our nets down for the birds' safety and make sure we don't get wet birds in nets. And so the number of hours that the nets are open varies, and we keep track of these for each of the 50 nets, and then combine it into a birds banded per netting effort for each day. and combine those into seasons. So 1970 in the spring, we have 1970 through 2019 data there. And we were up at a sort of level of between 10 and nearly 20 birds per net hour times 100. The index doesn't really matter. And you can see the dotted line showing that for the first 25 years, there was a long, slow decline in numbers going through there. And for the last 25 years, and this is really quite encouraging, the spring numbers have been pretty much steady. However, they're not like they used to be. And so given the 50 years of data, we have a very significant difference between the first 25 years and the last 25 years. And that decline is of the order of 40% or so. In the fall, the green graph on the right, again from 1970 up through 2020 in this case, just through our last season in just yesterday. And so in spring, our sample size was over 86,000 birds. In fall, our sample size is over 162,000 birds. Why are there more birds in fall? The season's a little longer, and obvious answer, drum roll please, they all bred. So we've got all the children. And so we have the adults returning in the fall migration, or those that have survived, which we hope is most of them, and we have all the immatures as well. And again, with those larger data samples, we are finding that, again, we have seen a very clear 50% reduction. And this corresponds with the alarm that I think was pretty widespread out of Cornell lab, where they said we've lost 50% of our songbirds. Interesting that we on the coast here, and looking just at migrants passing by, and with sample sizes of, yes, they're nice, but any one particular year, we're looking at 2,000 to 5,000 birds probably, and overall sample sizes of 250,000 new bandings. We are able to detect that and also confirm it with other estimates of populations. So the breeding bird survey during the breeding season, again, run by the Fish and Wildlife Service, is an excellent way because so many volunteers are running breeding bird migration routes and estimating the number of birds, doing counts for 25 miles, stopping every half mile, jumping out, counting the birds, jumping back in again. And this gives us an indication of the changes in breeding populations. And we are getting rather similar data there. Next slide, please. Not only can we do this for overall bird populations, but of course the immediate question any birder wants to know is, so what birds are declining? What birds are increasing? Yes, there's an overall decline. Is that everybody? And I've just put in one example here, and we really do like our neotropical migrants. So here's an absolutely classic neotropical migrant. This is the American redstart. The male is all black with the red in the tail. Redstart comes from an old name, looked a bit like a European bird, which is in the sort of chat family, not a warbler at all. And that had a red tail like that and was called the redstart or red sturt, probably stern if you go back to Old English. And so the folks who first saw black birds with red tails over here said, let's call them redstarts. And in fact, they are New World warblers, not in any way associated. But looking up at the map in the right-hand side of our picture here, we have Cornell Lab of Ornithology map, which they let us use very kindly. And the rusty red color there is the breeding range of the American redstart. So from Newfoundland in the east, all the way across into Northwest Territories and just about to the coast of Alaska, and then all the way east of the Mississippi and down the whole East Coast, except for maybe Florida and a bit of Georgia or South Carolina there. So that's their breeding range, a forest bird in boreal forest, and which is mostly conifers and mixed coniferous deciduous forest, likes second growth, likes thicker vegetation. And in the winter, these birds all fly down to the blue area, which is their wintering area. And that includes all of the Caribbean islands, southern Baja, Southern Mexico, we have worked with students in Belize. They're very common in the rainforest and the edge of the rainforest in Belize, through Central America and into the northeastern part of South America. And the yellow is the area that these birds will migrate across, particularly in spring up the western side of the USA. And in fall, they all tend to go a little bit further east, but they're moving down through. So here's an interesting bird. Here's a good near-tropical migrant. What are we finding? And our graphs over on the left, Dr. Matt Cam, working out of Michael Reed's lab at Tufts University, took this on as one of the analyses for his PhD studies with Michael. And we have spring and fall numbers of the graphs there. And again, don't worry too much about the population index, but basically the numbers of spring and fall migrants of American redstarts are about the same. And again, we have seen that decrease. In fact, there's a more than 50% decrease. And unfortunately, that's true of some of our near tropical migrants. They are the ones that are showing the biggest decreases. They have the furthest to go. Next slide, please. And this will turn us on to, I think, the last set question that we have. Danielle, what was that?
Yeah, we have actually had it come in from the audience. So what kind of effects have you been seeing from climate change on the birds that you're studying?
Perfect. A number of changes. The value, I think, is not necessarily that we're doing wonderful science. It's just we've done very consistent science. And we've done that very consistent science over 50 years. So we are in a position to detect some of the changes. Now, when Kathleen Anderson and the volunteers first started banding birds on the then Ernst property in 1966, climate change was not in our knowledge base. Nobody knew about climate change. People were seeing glaciers melting a bit maybe, but hadn't really thought of it. And it was not something that I learned about in university back in the 60s. However, it had been going on. And so one of the changes that we are able to look at is to look at individual species. This is the blue jay, and blue jay is a migrant. Blue jay is unusual in many ways. As David Sibley says, it's our only migrant jay. And the northern part of the population of blue jays, which breed right on up into as far as Newfoundland and up through into Canada, move south to get away from the very cold winters up there, obviously. And we will have a few blue jays certainly around in New England, especially in southern New England. But others of the blue jays will move on down through New York and down to the mid-Atlantic. And so Manomet has had a number of banding recoveries as far north in the spring as Nova Scotia. So banded birds at Manomet have turned up as far north as Nova Scotia, and mostly down the east coast in the fall. Banded blue jays have turned up as far south as, I think, the Carolinas, maybe a little further, and some of them will go as far as Florida. So they will certainly move down. Blue jays don't leave the United States, essentially, and they're an eastern and northern bird. And so this would be a very good bird to look at during the spring migrations. At the bottom of the graph here, this graph actually is a date graph across the bottom. So we're going to start on the bottom on the 29th of April, and we're going to go across to the 17th of May. And that encompasses a lot of the spring migration of blue jays. And as they pass through, we can tell the one or two blue jays, or maybe 3 or 4 in a good year, that have spent the winter at Manomet because we've banded them. We know who they are. We're only using the new birds that are coming in that we know are migrants passing by, so we've avoided that problem. And as we looked at the whole migration during on the bottom blue bar, from 1970 through 1979, so in other words, the decade of the 70s, the spring migration of blue jays had a median date of the 16th of May. In other words, half the migrant blue jays migrated north past us before the 16th of May, and the other half migrated past after the 16th of May. So that median, it's almost the same as an average. That median is a very good indicator of where is the center of the population of migrant blue jays in terms of timing. So that's good, 16th of May, sounds fine. What about the 80s? The next bar up is 1980 through 89. And so in the 80s, the median had moved back a couple of days to the 14th of May. Let's go on up to the 90s, and we're back to the 12th of May for the median bird. Back to the 2000 through 2009, the ORPs, and we're back to the 8th of May. And from 2010 through, and I think I actually moved this up to 2018 data, we're back to the 5th of May for that nearly a decade. So blue jays are arriving back earlier, and that was true of many of the birds that are passing through. Why, you ask? It's getting warmer. Why do blue jays care that it's getting warmer? They would like to get back to their breeding areas from their wintering areas as soon as possible to claim a territory. The males often migrating a little bit earlier than the females, just a few days, claiming a territory, the females following on behind, the females choosing the best males and the best territories. Everyone breeds, back they go again in the fall. And so these birds, both the males and the females, are under sexual selection to get back as quickly as possible to the breeding areas, get the good locations, get the good territories. In the case of the females, choose the best males and settle down and start breeding as quickly as possible. So back they come. And as it's warmer, then the first thing that happens is that the vegetation will react to that. So leaf out, and all our botanist friends can certainly tell us that, and we notice it in our gardens. The leaf out of the forests is a little bit earlier because the trees are responding to an earlier, warmer spring. As soon as the leaves leaf out, then a lot of the insects that have been in egg cases or hibernating over the winter hatch out and start eating on the leaves as quickly as possible. And the blue jays want to time their migration, as do many of the majority of the others of our migrants, with that leaf out. So they are coming back earlier and earlier and earlier and synchronizing with the earlier leaf out. So that's very clear correlation there between earlier arrival of many birds, including near tropical migrants, and even including the humble blue jay that doesn't seem to migrate very much, but it does, and it migrates in the daytime. I think the next slide would be a good one to look at as well.
Trevor, before you move on from the blue jays, we do have a question about what the sample sizes for each period were in the blue jay median passage graph.
Yeah, question. Off the top of my head, don't know. Let's see. I think we're dealing with between about 50 and 150 blue jays each spring. So it's not a very big sample size, and there's a lot of variation. But the nice thing is that if you were to look at it year by year, there would be a jagged line that would not be so smooth. And the advantage, I think, that we have is that when we look at it decade by decade, then we're looking at 10 times that many per year. And those decades show the picture a lot more clearly. Let's move on to the next one. And some birds have, and this would require you to be an old birder. Again, our founder, Kathleen Anderson, told me that back in the 50s, she and some birding friends went rushing down to Cape Cod, and they were going down there to see a rare bird that was very exciting. It was a cardinal, and it was nesting on Cape Cod in Massachusetts. This is very exciting. So cardinals are essentially southern birds, and there are a range of other species that we can think of like that. Carolina wrens would be one example, tufted titmouse, cardinals, mockingbirds. These were southern birds. You can include in there turkey vultures, if you like, and red-bellied woodpeckers. And those species have been moving northwards. Again, a correlation with climate change. As the climate warms, a lot of those birds really are hardly migrants or not migrants at all. Mockingbirds don't migrate, they don't go anywhere. Cardinals do a little bit of moving, and it's only a movement away from the breeding area. As they move away from the breeding area and disperse during the fall, away from the parental territories, often even chased away by the parents, then they'll move out to the coast in some cases. And so we at Manomet have this strange phenomenon where we see numbers of blue jays coming by, numbers of cardinals that don't migrate at all. Amazing years when we catch 3,500 black-capped chickadees, which aren't supposed to migrate, all in one fall as they pass by. And then other years where we only catch 100. And so looking at the cardinals here, we had very, very few cardinals. Just again, the summary decades on the right in green. And that's just the sheer numbers of cardinals. So here's the sample size right here. From 1970 to 1979, we had 150 odd cardinals. And each one was exciting in the early years in our mist netting. In the 80s, we were up 275-ish. In the 1990s, moving across, we're over 450 cardinals in the decade. And the aughts were up over 500. And the teens were up over 680-ish, I think. And actually 2020 was our biggest year. We actually caught 98 cardinals this year during the fall migration. So during that fall dispersal, and it's not really a migration, but during that fall dispersal, that gives us a chance to see whether some of these birds that were so rare or unknown in Massachusetts back in the 30s and 40s have not only come into our area and are now moving on north, and of course cardinals and many of these species are now breeding right up into southern Canada as they've moved up over the 50 years. But we can also put numbers to it and see the trends. So I think that covers enough of that.
Excellent. So we have many questions that have come in. And so the first question for you, Trevor, is about ravens. Judith has been reading a book by Bernd Heinrich about ravens. And are there any ravens in our area?
Yes, Heinrich loved ravens, didn't he? And a lot of people have loved ravens. When I was a wee young lad, age 21, I spent a lot of time hanging on a rope, trying to get to ravens' nests on a cliff on an island off the coast of Wales. Ravens are found all the way around the northern part of the world, in Europe and in Asia and in North America. And the answer in 1969, when Manomet started, are there any ravens in Massachusetts? No, that's a northern bird, we would have said. They were in Canada and all the way across the boreal zone. They're particularly common when working with Stephen Brown and people in the shorebirds group on the Arctic National Refuge up there and the extreme north coast of the Arctic on the Beaufort Sea and northern Alaska. And you'll see ravens flying along there. So ravens are found in all sorts of habitats. They, for some reason, have started to do really well. And I don't think we exactly know the reasons. But 20 years ago, 1 or 2 ravens started to appear, not just in central New England, but also coming down into Massachusetts, and some were found on the North Shore. And then a few years back, a raven turned up on the Cape Cod Canal and was nesting on the power station down there. And so ravens have actually been moving from the north down, not particularly migrant birds, hardly at all. So not really involved in any migrations there. They're very sedentary, but they have been increasing throughout New England and also right down here. Now, there have always been ravens in the mountains. So if you followed the Appalachians down, there were ravens down as far as North Carolina. But now they have been increasing in good numbers and appearing here. So I actually have a flight line of ravens over my house every night. I counted 21 a few nights back. I think they're going from the Middleburg dump, and I'm pretty sure they're going to be spending the night in Halifax. And so the thought of seeing 21 ravens passing by and all going croak, croak, croak as they go is not something you would have predicted 50 years ago.
Excellent. I have a question from an old friend, Mark Woodry. So at their long-term fall migration banding station in coastal Alabama, they have seen a drastic decline in the number of gray catbirds captured in a given season, from a high of 1,200 individuals per season in the early to mid 1990s to less than 100 individuals per season in the mid 2010s. Have you seen a similar pattern at Manomet?
Yes, gosh, that whole operation down there has been running almost as long as Manomet. And it's in an ideal situation to particularly get spring migrants coming over the Gulf and landing there. And I know Mark has been so involved with that over the years. Mark from Ohio, back in the good old days. Yeah, Mark, we don't have the decrease that you see. Catbird is our most banded bird, as you could probably surmise. And I think we've handled, I'm guessing a bit, 30,000, something like that, 30,000 odd catbirds over all the years. And so when I look at the long-term trends, it's a very common breeding bird in the whole southern New England area, in scrubby habitats. And then there's a big migration south, and they pretty much all leave us. We might find one or two on a Christmas count on Cape Cod or around Manomet, we're lucky, but not so much inland. And so we have probably seen a slight decrease of the order of 10, 20% over the 50 years, but nothing like the decline that you've seen. We don't really know where our catbirds spend the winter. We see them going, our banding recoveries are mostly east of you and Alabama down there. And so most of our catbirds are going right down the coast. Most of our banding recoveries have been along the coast and down into Florida. And we do not, unfortunately, have any other recoveries south of there. So I suspect we're looking at the eastern population, and you're looking at a slightly more western population of the same species. So something's going on with the more westerly populations, but we've actually seen about the same numbers, at least up here in the north.
Excellent. And so Trevor, do water birds migrate at night? Brant geese are an example.
Depends on the bird. If you go down to Manomet Point, one of the earliest activities at Manomet, actually even before the mist netting started, was that people like my friend Wayne Peterson and Kathleen Anderson and some of the good old time birders would all go down to Manomet Point, which we saw on that early slide, which is just off the end of Manomet, which sticks right out into Cape Cod Bay. And there they would be counting species going by, flying by, during particularly the fall migration. So that was particularly good for scoters. There would be some brant geese, but particularly scoters flying by. And you would see them starting about 10:30 in the morning, which is a wonderful time for birders to get up, as opposed to all the songbird people who have to get up at dawn. And then they would be passing by in the fall. We'd see white-winged scoters, we'd see surf scoters, we'd see black scoters, and lots of loons, and some geese passing by, some marine geese like brant passing by. And then that would all tail off, and they would end up in Cape Cod Bay, and then they may indeed fly over from there and go on down as far as the mid-Atlantic and a little further south. So that's a daytime migration, and that is fairly typical of most waterfowl, but they're certainly capable of flying long distances, and they're certainly capable of flying over land. And I think brant geese do that in the spring. We know they do it in the spring. And many of those scoters were doing that in the fall. What they were doing was coming out of breeding areas in the Arctic, coming down to Hudson's Bay, rafting up there, seen in very large numbers on the Great Lakes, particularly at Whitefish Point in Michigan. And again, they all accumulate on the Great Lakes one evening in the fall. And then the next morning you go out and you look and they're gone. And so what they had done is take off into the dusk, and like so many of our songbird migrants had flown nonstop from the Great Lakes down to somewhere between Maine and Cape Cod, landed, and then we're moving on down the point. So we were seeing the tail end of a long overland migration, and then followed by a daytime migration as they got down to their resting area in Cape Cod Bay. So like so many of the songbirds, they're capable of putting a lot of fat on and using that stored fat as fuel, and are quite capable, brant geese too, are quite capable of very long distance migrations. In Britain, where I grew up birding with my parents, we would find brant geese from Russia coming into winter in Britain, and they would fly that very long distance, and they certainly fly overland during that migration too.
Excellent. Are there any species that seem to be able to avoid getting caught in a mist net?
Oh, yes. The ones you really want to catch. The one rare bird you see. We once had it was a pewee, which is a kind of flycatcher, which says pewee. except for the Western peewee. And the Western peewee doesn't see peewee. And we thought we heard a Western peewee. And there it was, sitting right in between our 50 mist nets. And there it stayed for about 2 days and it flew away. And no, we never catch it. Yeah, we catch mostly songbirds. So obviously we do not catch shorebirds up in the nets at Manomet among those trees and bushes and around the edges of our wetlands. The only shorebird I can remember turning up in the LANDBIRD nets was a sanderling. And the sanderling was missing a few things, like all of its feathers and its head. And a peregrine falcon had been hanging around on the beach just down below the net. So our assumption is that the peregrine falcon flew up, and for mysterious reasons known to peregrine, only to peregrine, he flew into our mist nets, going up to perch in a tree. And before that, he had actually plucked the sanderling and eaten, dropped, don't know, lost the head somewhere. And so that bird was then dropped into the top of our mist nets. So the thought of a featherless and headless sanderling flying from the beach into the mist net didn't seem like the likely explanation. We went for the peregrine. But more seriously, yes, there are species that stay fairly high in the canopy. We're lucky at Manomet, and I should have emphasized this before, because we get hurricanes and we get winter storms. And that keeps the vegetation fairly consistently low right along the coast where we are at Manomet. So we're not suffering from the problem that many bird banders inland do when they try to say what birds are typical of my area. As a forest grows up, then the species composition or the numbers change, and that's due to change in the habitat. So we're lucky having a fairly consistent habitat, and we try to keep it as consistent as possible. But species like kinglets, which we catch in good numbers, both golden-crowned and ruby-crowned, generally avoid the nets by being high up in the canopy. The classic bird that will always get caught in the mist net is a catbird or a common yellowthroat, some of those low, scrubby, shrubby birds that fly usually below the 7-foot height that we have for mist nets. Yeah, in the past we did experiment by putting 3 mist nets on top of each on top of the other and creating towering mist nets. We did that in the rainforest in Central America, and that's a good way to sample vertically there. But it overwhelmed our consistency when we did that at Manomet. And B, it's miserable trying to take down 3 mist nets and then take a tangled chickadee from the very top one, who's quite furious by the time you've got him down on a series of pulleys. So yeah, the canopy top species are very good at avoiding mist nets. And also we're a scrubby, shrubby habitat. So we have never caught an eastern meadowlark, even though they pass by. We've only caught, I think, something of the order of 3 or 4 bluebirds total ever, even though it's not a particularly uncommon bird. And so those are open country birds. So most of the migrants are migrating at night. Things you wouldn't expect certainly will turn up in mist nets. We have caught rails that were migrating at night and flew into a mist net on the edge of some of our wetlands. We have had seabirds like dovekies blown inshore during northeast gales and turning up, wandering around on the Manomet property. But there's those you obviously don't expect to catch in the mist net. So we're mainly using our songbird data as an example here. But it is consistent from year to year. So if we only catch 10% of the golden crown kinglets that are hopping around the tops of the trees in the 70s, then it's probably only 10% in the 80s and the 90s and the aughts and the teens. And so that consistency, even though the sample size is lower than we would like, gives us, we feel, a legitimate comparison as to whether kinglet populations are increasing or decreasing.
I have a couple of questions specifically about fall migration. So first, why is the fall migration season longer than the spring?
Well, we've got the adults coming back in the fall, and we've also got the immature birds, the birds hatched in that current year coming back in the fall. When we band birds in the lab, we take a lot of details quickly, probably less than a minute, as we handle each bird from coming out of the bird bag where we've carried them back from the nets. And then we take the bird out, we put a Fish and Wildlife band on, we record it with our recorder on the computer, and then we record the species, obviously, the age and the sex, the date and the time are automatically recorded on the computer. We take wing length, which will be an indication in some cases of sex, for example. So male red-winged blackbirds are bigger than female red-winged blackbirds, so they have longer wings. Grackles that look sort of alike, males are much bigger. So again, we have measurements there. We also record subcutaneous fat by blowing the feathers apart at the top of the breast and the wishbone area. And we weigh the birds and we record any molt that's on them, and then off they go again, all within a minute or so. So yeah, we do know all of that as they pass through. And the story in spring is that there is that sexual selection. All of the small songbirds that are passing through Manomet in the spring are going to be breeding. There are very few non-breeders in their first year. It's not like geese or ducks where they won't necessarily breed for the first few years. We see a lot of eider ducks hanging around all summer off Manomet on the rocks. They just are young birds that aren't going back to the northern areas to breed. And so in the spring, there's a rapid movement. The males come a few days earlier than the females, but for most of the songbirds, it's only 1 or 2 days earlier, at most 4 or 5. American redstart, I think it's 6 or 7 days earlier for the males. And the older birds come through a little earlier. So the older males come a little earlier than the younger males. The younger males and the old females come through in spring at the same time, and the younger females are last in spring. But again, that whole span is only a few days, at most a week. In the fall, things are spread out. There is no rush to get back to a breeding area because the birds have now bred. The adults are moving back to their traditional wintering area, wherever that may be. And it might be just on Cape Cod, or it might be all the way down into the Amazon, depending on the species. But the immatures are moving more slowly. They are going through a molt out of their juvenile plumage into their adult plumage. And so we see a distinct separation of the older birds coming by earlier in the fall and the younger birds later. So I think it's a combination of two groups of birds, older and younger birds moving south in the fall at different times, adults first, immatures later. And also just the longer period and not under the impetus to get back to breed, which would be true of the birds and the adult birds in spring. There are also twice as many birds, so it takes them a while.
All right, I think that Danielle froze Trevor, so I'm going to jump in for her. So we only have a couple minutes left, so maybe we can do 1 or 2 more questions. So Jason asks, have there been any trends that were surprising or shocking to you that maybe warranted a closer look or more research?
Yes, there are some birds that are really not very well known in Christmas bird counts or in breeding bird surveys. For example, some of the boreal, far northern boreal forest warblers that are mostly breeding in northern New England and mostly across the boreal region of Canada, which is pretty much further than most humans live. And so species like Cape May warbler and bay-breasted warbler and Tennessee warbler, we thought of as very rare birds. And then suddenly from 1974 through 1979, we started catching more, a few more in spring and a whole lot more in fall, including very large numbers of hatching year birds. And so this was one of those examples of what's going on here. Why do we suddenly have this peak? And from 74 to 79, by about 1980, 81, there were very few. And there really have not been any large numbers of particularly bay-breasted and Cape Mays passing through Manomet, either spring or fall since. It's quite a red letter day if we catch a bay-breasted warbler. 1 or 2 in spring, maybe 3 or 4 in fall, maybe 5, that sort of number. So what was going on? And that gets you excited, and we started working with other people and calling other bird observatories and looking around. And the answer, of course, was that, something amazing happened at the same time. From the Great Lakes right out to the Maritimes in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, a plague of spruce budworms, which are very soft and to a bird, very delicious caterpillars, were causing defoliation all the way across the spruce moose zone, the red spruce, the white spruce, and the balsam fir. and causing damage to the forests, which mostly recovered, mostly. But there's an absolute bonanza and a releaser for the populations of those birds that were in that precise habitat. And so those indicator species showed us that, that they were responding. And although there's a long, slow decline, as there is unfortunately for so many of our near-tropical migrants, the Cape Mays winter in the Caribbean islands, and the bay-breasted warblers winter from Panama southwards into northwestern part of South America. The populations increased tremendously by up to 600% during that one period, just because there was abundant food in the breeding season. And we certainly would not have predicted that.
Excellent. So it looks like we're right at 5 now. Do we want to close out by maybe talking about some of the rarer birds that you've seen over the years? We had a couple of questions from folks.
Somebody usually asks that. Good, I'm glad somebody asks. Let's go on to, I think we've got about 4 or 5 slides. So let's just go on to the next slide and we'll talk about it. Yeah, here's one of the rarer birds. Good quiz bird, even for quite good birders, unless you are a warbler specialist. So this is a nice near-tropical migrant warbler. And blue-winged warblers and golden-winged warblers, we believe, are so close, even though they are different species, that they have presumably deviated from a parental species recently. Recently can be 10,000 years or 100,000 years, but recently enough that they are still able to respond to each other's songs. The females will respond to the males of the other species, blue-wing to golden-wing, golden-wing to blue-wing. And it's a classic example of Mendelian genetics, which you may or may not have remembered from school or college or wherever you were incarcerated in your youth. But there are dominant genes and there are recessive genes. And so if a blue-winged and a golden-winged warbler breed together, the least likely combination of hybrid to survive is this one, which is called the Lawrence's warbler. It has the blue wings and the white wing bars of a blue-winged warbler. It has the black throat and the broad black around the eye of a golden-winged warbler. And so that's a first-generation hybrid. And so if you want to say, is that a rare bird? Yes, we've got 3, I believe, in the last 50 years. And with the decline, tremendous decline in the number of golden-winged warblers, these are getting rarer and rarer. Next slide, please. And I think we put in a rare bird there. Oh, that was in answer to one of those questions that I get so frequently, which is, what is the biggest bird you catch? He looks a little upset. He's actually in Abanda's hands, and Emily has cropped it so that we can get a really good view of the upper parts and the head. And this is a young red-shouldered hawk. They actually breed on the property and they stay there all winter. This is not a migrant species with us, so we have a family. And every now and again, one of the immatures gets caught. So that's about the largest that our mist nets can hold. And this net is 7 feet high. It has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 taut panels running horizontally along and then netting draped in loops below each of the panels. And so when a small bird flies into a mist net, he makes a little pocket. It's like you falling off the high wire in the circus, and then he drops into the pocket. We come around, we take him out. Life is good. When a large bird goes in, the net usually gets caught in the bushes behind. The bird shoots out, turns around and flies away. So that's about the biggest bird we can handle. And this is a red-shouldered hawk. And I think on average, we've been catching about 1 a year recently. Then there's the what's the rare bird? And this is, again, an example of what's the rare bird. On the left is one of the more obscure species. If you look closely, on my left anyway, the bird in the hand with the knuckles towards you, in case your screen is reversed for some unknown reason, is a Bell's vireo. And this was the first for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts ever, and turned up in our nets. This is a species that breeds in the center of the country and the southwest, and then migrates down south in the winter into the tropical regions, and so should not be anywhere near eastern North America. And yet, as we all know, with rarities, every now and again, a strong west wind blows somebody off course. I think this little Bell's vireo here, which has a slight hook on the tip of the bill, tells you it's not a warbler, has a nice little broken white line above and below the eye, beautiful black iris, a good big wing bar and a not very good anterior further north pale wing bar, and basically no other identifying features. It's the one you come to at the end of the key when you've tried everything else. And so that was our first Bell's vireo. And then the second for the Commonwealth also turned up on our nets. I think some astute birders found the third one for the Commonwealth, which was down in Falmouth and found by birders, which was very exciting for them. With our banded birds, we band the bird, we let it go, we take photographs, and then it disappears over the horizon. And with the best will in the world, we just can't show people. They disappear, they're gone. The third, fourth Bell's vireo again turned up on our nets. So very unusual in that sense. If we could just go back to the previous slide, the bird on the right, funnily enough, is not a vireo. The bird on the right is a flycatcher, and this is the only record of the Western flycatcher, either Cordilleran or Pacific Coast, and they were lumped together as one species until 10 years ago, something like that. And so that is, as far as we knew, at least until very recently, the only record. And again, that turned up in our nets with a broader bill and some whiskers around the base of the bill, but otherwise just one of those difficult flycatchers that it would be awfully hard for a birder to pick out, including me. I think you had down below one of our really unusual birds. Let's move on to that. Yeah, that was a rufous-sided towhee, or an eastern towhee. Not an unusual bird, you say. Do we get them? Yeah, good scruffy, shrubby bird. And these are two pictures of the same bird. So this, not only is it a towhee, it delights in the name of a bilateral gynandromorph, one of my favorite phrases to baffle poor students. And so the left side of this bird, which is confusingly on the right as we look at the screen, is a male towhee, which is black. Male towhees are black. Both males and females have white bellies and rufous sides and rufous undertail coverts. But the male has black wings, black body plumage, and a black tail. And on the other side of the photograph is apparently a sort of scruffy brown female. So she's got mostly brown plumage, except for a little bit of black on her chest, on her throat. And she's got brown wings. And actually, if you could see that side of her tail, she's brown. And the catch here is this is the same bird. So somewhere in the very early development of the embryo, the left side of that bird developed into a male, and the right side developed into a female, and it survived, and it looked very healthy. It has a nice red eye, and it's either male or female, or possibly both. And male towhees, bird banders know, have slightly longer wings than females because they're a little bit bigger. And so we put on a male size Fish and Wildlife band just in case the leg needed the bigger band. It did seem to, and measured the male wing and then measured the female wing on the other side. And there was a 3 or 4 or 5 millimeter difference. I forget now, about 4 millimeters, I think. So on his left side, he had a male wing, and on her right side, she had a female wing. Don't see many of those.
Thank you, Trevor. That was absolutely fascinating. And I think from the comments that I've seen come in, many of you on this webinar have agreed with that. Thank you, everybody, for bringing your questions today and for taking part in our conversation. We will be following up tomorrow with a link to today's presentation and hope that you'll share it with your friends and family and beyond. I know that many of you are longtime supporters of Manomet, and so I just wanted to take the opportunity to say thank you. We are very grateful for your generosity and support, and we could not do our work without you. We hope to see you again on a future webinar, or hopefully maybe in the banding lab come this spring. Thank you so much, and hope that everyone has a great rest of their day. Goodbye.
Thank you so much.